Oop. Oh well. So the 1866 Our Vote hotline, as I said, is the real centerpiece of the program, and then we have these other subsidiary hotlines as well for other languages like Spanish, Asian languages, and Arabic. So when you call in, there's also a national command center. There's also the technology that routes the calls to the local call centers. And then the volunteers on the ground are the ones that are actually interacting with the voters. The local command and call centers then go back out to election officials to help solve the problems, and then ultimately, if we need to, as I said, into court. So most of you will be serving, I think all of you will be serving as grassroots poll monitors. You're the eyes and ears of the Election Protection Coalition. And your job is to know how to spot problems and to help voters access the 1866 Our Vote hotline, to record what you see and then to report it. So there's two very important numbers, and all this information and these slides will be available. But the command center is a way, and plus my cell will be a way to reach me directly, and then to direct voters who are having issues to the hotline. You can also be a resource to voters to make sure they know their rights and to answer very basic questions about voting, like how long are the polls open? If I'm not on the list, what do I do? But that actually you refer back to the hotline. You'll be gathering information. There is a polling place assessment that we gather data on, which we have on paper form, but we're also trying to get you to put the information later onto a Google form so that it's in a more usable format, and we don't have to do all that after the fact. We want you to record information so that we can use it later, and to report all these problems to the hotline so it will also record it. It's kind of built in suspenders, but we want to make sure that everything happens. We don't have an exit poll here in Massachusetts, although we do have a polling place survey. So one of the things that we ask our poll monitors to do is to sign an agreement about what kind of conduct you're going to have on election day. I will email this to the list. You got an email to get onto this webinar, so I do have your email address. Basically, it says that you have received training and that you understand that your role is an educational one, that you will not advocate for a candidate, political party, ballot question, or campaign, not engage in any kind of electioneering, not challenge any voter's eligibility to vote or interfere and intimidate a voter, not ask how the voter voted, all kinds of things, act in a very reasonable and non-confrontational manner, or interfere with the workings of the polling place, and not speak on behalf of the Election Protection Coalition, even if asked for comment by the media. You'll need to talk to us first about that.
Also salad in the fridge.
Excuse me? All right, let's try to stay, yeah. So our priority locations are primary Boston, Lawrence, Lowell, Springfield, and Worcester, as well as Brockton, Randolph. We're going to throw in perhaps a Salem or perhaps a New Bedford for folks that really want to do that. But we're going to try to concentrate because we have a few less volunteers than we did last year. So you'll be getting a polling place assignment. Sophia Hall from the Lawyers Committee has been doing a lot of the polling place assignments. One of the first things you want to do when you get there to your polling place is to look around and see what's happening. So just survey the area to see, are there any lines? Is it handicap accessible? Is the poll open when it's supposed to be? And there's a survey that we'll want you to fill out. So you'll be looking at those questions. After you sort of just get a lay of the land, you'll want to go inside and introduce yourself to the warden or our election supervisor, or any of the other poll workers, but they'll direct you to the warden. The warden is the person in charge of the polling place. And you want to tell them that you're an observer from the Election Protection Coalition, and that we have notified the municipality that we'll be there and talk to the Secretary of State. Observers in Massachusetts have a right to be there, we'll go a little bit further into your role in just a second. We're hoping to have you as teams. We're going to be assigning 2 at a time. Ideally, and you'll have a couple of different polls to choose from. You could split up and cover of the 3 polls you get. You could split up and have one person at one and one together. If you're not comfortable, you can do it together with one monitor on the inside and one on the outside. As a monitor or observer, you're allowed to be inside the electioneering boundary. In fact, you're allowed to be right inside the door. They do not, however, if you're inside, have to give you a chair. They usually will, but they don't have to. It depends on how many are actually there. As I said, you need to complete your polling place survey. When you're outside, your goal there is to make sure voters have the information they need to vote. We'll have some palm cards for you that are talking about your rights as a voter. You hand those out, but don't insist on anything. It's their choice to decide whether they want your help or not your help. You can ask voters what their voting experience was about as they leave, but only outside or outside of the polling area. You cannot do it in the voting area. Inside the voting area, you need to be very quiet. You're not allowed to roam around the voting area. The warden will give you a place to stand, and you need to be there very quietly. You must mute your phone and not talk on it. If you get a call, you have to go outside. Can't even say hello. You need to be very, very, very quiet. But if you do observe a problem, you should report it immediately to the command center or to the 1866 our vote hotline. Again, you need to remove yourself from the outside of the voting area. So the kinds of things you'll need to bring are a cell phone and a charger, because that will allow you to look things up. Ideally a smartphone, a polling place assessment survey. We'll have that and intake forms for you. There's our phone numbers, whether you have that on the information sheet or you just jot them down, that's fine. Some palm cards. We'll have an election protection button for you. You want to make sure you're in warm clothes with comfortable shoes in layers so you can go inside and outside, and have a snack and a water bottle with you too. Oops, sorry. So obviously we need to be really, really careful about what we do. You cannot record voters, whether with their permission or not, inside the voting place. You can do a video with them after they've left, but you really should get some handwritten permission, even if it's just on a piece of paper, with their signature. So inside, it's really a matter of just observing, finding out what's happening. So we haven't met with the Secretary of State yet. That's happening on Friday. It got pushed back for a couple of different reasons. It was supposed to be earlier this year, but in the past, we've not been allowed to wear our election protection buttons inside. I'm not sure why. It makes no sense, but we'll clarify that. If you're answering questions directly, make sure you're answering the ones that are covered on the palm card, like hours of voting, voter registration deadline. But if there's any complicated questions or special assistance, have them call the 1-866-OUR-VOTE hotline from your phone. And stay in contact with us if there are any problems at your location. So as I showed you in the poll monitor agreement, obviously no electioneering kind of information. If you're working for a candidate, you cannot do it at the same time, or a ballot question. If you are volunteering for a campaign, you can do that, but ideally at a different polling place. Well, at a different polling place, period. Not during the same time frame. So now we're going to move on to a second part of the training, which is about the kinds of laws and issues that you need to be aware of when you're doing election protection. The kinds of things we run into are issues with voter registration, not on election day so much about early and absentee voting, but sometimes. Voter identification, there's a few issues around that here in Massachusetts, although we're in a much better spot than a lot of places. Voter challenges, provisional voting, assistance at the polling place, equipment, and other polling place issues. So voter registration issues is probably the one that you'll come up against the most, and that is when a voter thinks they're should be on the rolls and they're not, or are in the wrong place. So that can happen for a lot of different reasons. Somebody moved, they became inactive because they didn't return the census card. There was some clerical error in their registration process. And sometimes there are some polling worker issues as well. So in order to vote, a voter must be registered by October 17th, 2018. So that deadline has passed. But if they we don't have election day registration, and we don't have same day registration during our early voting period. So if they haven't registered by the 17th, they're out of luck. So, to register as a voter in Massachusetts, you just have to be a resident of the city and town in which you live, be 18 years or older, not be incarcerated, under guardianship, or convicted of voter fraud, and be a U.S. citizen. So if you've moved, you are allowed to vote at your old address within Massachusetts for 6 months, and without having to re-register during that period. After 6 months, you're not, and if you haven't re-registered, you're not allowed to vote. If you move in from out of state, you can't, or go out of state, you're not supposed to come back to Massachusetts during that 6-month period. You're supposed to re-register. You know, this kind of comes up because somebody name might not be on the rolls, or they say, I moved a year ago, what do I do? So often they'll just say, my name wasn't on the list. And you want to ask them, where and when did you register? Just try to get to the bottom end. Are you a first-time voter? Have you moved since you last registered? Did you receive a voter registration confirmation card? Try to ask as many questions as you can to get them engaged, and then you can also refer them to the hotline. So there is a way to look up the voter on and to where they're registered and their voter registration status. If you have a smartphone, you can do that for them. That's very helpful. And the next slide will show you where. It's at the Secretary of State's website. You can also, if the voter is voting for the first time after registering by mail, they're going to have to provide information. And if they're not a first-time voter, sometimes they may not be on a list because they become inactive. We'll go into that in a minute, and they can be on a different list. So in any case, if you look them up and they do not appear to be a voter anyway, you would encourage them to vote on a provisional ballot, which is the ballot of last resort, but everyone is entitled to one. The problem with it is they don't count unless they're cast in the right precinct. So this is the URL for looking up voters, and you put in their name, first name, last name, their date of birth, and then their zip code, and then it will tell you this is supposed to be for the voter. Do it with their permission. It'll tell you where they're registered and what their registration status is, and it's just at the Secretary of State's website. It's a little long, but you can see it over here. You'll be able to copy it down from this slideshow or from other materials that we will provide. And that will tell you, a lot of information. And if they are registered at a different address and had moved, they need to go to the place they are registered, not the place where they moved to. They haven't re-registered. So provisional voting, you've probably heard about that. That's a ballot of last resort. It was established by the Help America Vote Act in 2002. All states must offer provisional ballot. The voter's eligibility to vote is in question. There's all sorts of issues with them about whether the ballot itself will count, if the worker completes the process officially and all thoroughly. And then sometimes the precincts will only have a limited number of provisional ballots, and they'll give them out and they'll refuse to give them, and that is a violation of law. So in Massachusetts, we have very strict rules around provisional ballots. Some states actually are much more liberal when it comes to counting provisional ballots. In Massachusetts, if they cast a provisional ballot in the wrong precinct, it will not count, period. Even for U.S. Senate, or if it was a presidential year and president, even though it doesn't matter what precinct you're in, none of the races will count. If a voter is given a provisional ballot, they need to follow up with the clerk to find out whether it has been counted and if there's any additional information that's needed to be provided. So they should give the voter information about how to contact the clerk after the fact. There is much, much better to get a different kind of ballot if possible, a regular ballot or something called a challenge ballot, because the burden of proof is very different. So if a poll worker tells a voter they must vote provisionally, that's fine. But if the voter believes that they are registered in that precinct and that they should get a regular ballot, the first thing you do is to try to look up online where they are registered and if they're at the right place. Obviously, if you can confirm that, they can bring, the phone in or something to show the other person, or they can look it up on their own phone. If they can't find it, provisional ballot is the right ballot to get, and encourage the voter to follow up with after the fact. In Massachusetts, we have, and in most states, we have something called inactive voters. Every state has different rules about how you get onto the inactive voting list. You may remember that Ohio had their inactive voting lists challenged, and they were held to be problematic. Massachusetts' procedure isn't very different from Ohio's, frankly. In Massachusetts, voters who do not return the state census, the street list card, for 2 years in a row become inactive, no matter how frequently they vote. Sometimes, so you could vote in every election and still become an inactive voter. Part of the problem is that every municipality administers this slightly differently. Boston is very liberal. Other communities are very different. So if you are an inactive voter, it will be marked on the same list as regular voters with an I, or sometime on a totally separate list. And sometimes poll workers forget that there is a second list. And this is where we often end up with problems of people being denied a ballot or being given the wrong ballot. Because if you're an active voter, you get to vote on a regular ballot, not a provisional ballot. If you provide an ID, and if you don't have an ID, you get to actually have a regular ballot that's challenged by the poll worker. Again, this is much better than a provisional ballot, is because one, they never have enough provisional ballots. So that means there'll be less for the people that really need them. And two, just because the burden of proof on the provisionals is the opposite way around. Often the voter will have to fill out something called the affidavit of continuous residence, basically saying, I really haven't moved, I've really lived here, and this is my real address. On voter ID, there's obviously big problems across the country with strict voter ID laws. Massachusetts does not have a strict voter ID law, but we still do have to show ID under certain circumstances. The Help America Vote Act, again, started some basic procedures that all states must follow. When voters register for the first time by mail, they have to show some kind of proof of residence. Doesn't have to be a photo ID, showing that they are where they reside here in Massachusetts and that this is their address. Massachusetts follows these same rules. So other kinds of voters sometimes that have to, and inactive voters have to show ID. And if a voter is asked by a poll worker because their identity is in doubt, like, I think you might be somebody else, they do have a right to ask for identification. Identification, though, isn't a photo ID. It's never a photo ID. It can be a photo ID, but it can also be a utility bill, bank statement, paycheck, cell phone bill, government check, or any document showing your name and address. And it can also be on a phone. Does not have to be on paper. So some of the things that we've seen in other states, including, and actually we've seen a few of those here, It has been a while since we've had any mass caging activities in Massachusetts where you have, you know, a mailing that goes out challenging voters, or where they say election day for Democrats is one day and for Republicans is a different way. But we've had occasional intimidation activities at various polls across the state. In Massachusetts, anyone can challenge a person's right to vote, but that challenger must provide a specific valid reason. So they aren't who they say they are, they don't live where they say they live, or they're registered in another community. If challenged, the voter has a right to sign an oath and vote a regular ballot. It gets to be marked and signed, but the person challenging has the burden of proof to prove that the voter is problematic, not the other way around. They're innocent until proven guilty. So these are the specific reasons written out, not who they say they are, not where they live where they say they live, not in the correct district. They're not qualified to vote by absentee ballot. That would be an absentee ballot objection. Not registered, has already cast a ballot. They have to list one of these specific issues. So again, this is kind of detailed, but these are important. A provisional ballot is what first-time voters who do not have an ID have to cast. It is when someone is not on the list and cannot be found elsewhere in the state. It must be offered rather than turning a voter away completely. And after they investigate it, an election official may count the ballot. A challenge ballot is actually a regular ballot with additional procedures. It always counts unless the person challenging can prove that the voter is inappropriate in some way. It is what inactive voters cast when they have an ID. So another thing we see sometimes is somebody who has needs language assistance or is disabled and wants to have somebody to assist the voter. So a voter can get assistance from a person of their own choice. The poll worker can certainly assist the voter, but if the voter wants to have their grandson or their granddaughter or their neighbor, it's their choice, not the poll worker's choice. And sometimes we find that poll workers are not letting people be assisted by somebody they want. And sometimes we have kind of suspect characters that are foisting themselves on people in the polling place, and that's not appropriate either. So we also have to have translation available at the polling place if there's sufficiently large populations in the area. Usually, you know, there oftenly be that, but sometimes there are problems, and we don't have enough bilingual poll workers to deal with them. So that's an issue you need to both report and be aware of. Sometimes the optical scanners will malfunction. That's a lot better than a DRE malfunctioning, but it will back up, and the poll workers should then actually store those ballots. That's appropriate procedure, but you should let us know about equipment breakdowns. Precincts should never, ever run out of ballots. The law in Massachusetts is that everyone every polling place needs to have a ballot for every registered voter in the district. Occasionally this becomes an issue when they break that law and bring half of the ballots or something like that. I don't expect it to be an issue this time, but if you have a particularly long ballot, sometimes things go awry. So the printing does run out of ballots and has stopped things and are waiting, lines are forming. What do you respond? How do you respond? The first thing you always do is you call the command center and or the 1866 Our Vote hotline. You try to talk, that's an instance where you'd be outside, talking to voters in the line, asking them to wait. Try to get as many facts as possible about what's going on. And if you can, document the number of people or get their story, I couldn't stay because I had to go back to the babysitter or whatever. Both in terms of wait times and specific stories, that would be great. So often there will be other issues. I'm not sure, again, we have early voting that got put in place largely for some of the things that election protection documented in the 2012 election. But if you do have very long lines, sometimes we can get additional poll workers there to help ease them out. Sometimes there's problems with voting lists. There was one time in Cambridge where only every third name was printed out. So a few, 2/3 of the voters didn't have their name on the list. Sometimes polls are open late or open late instead of the 7 a.m. opening time. So, and then as I said at the beginning, sometimes we have poll workers that are acting inappropriately. We've had poll workers that have been passing out ballots and telling people how to vote at the same time. That's obviously a huge problem. Or adding people to the voting list that weren't supposed to be there, just like writing names in, or kind of trying to discourage people from voting who, this was a city election in Lawrence. But that, again, this doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. So anytime you see any of these, again, we call in and record. So here are the numbers, the command center, of course, the 1866 Our Vote hotline, Sophia Hall, and my cell phone numbers. If you can't get through, you can also text message me or Sophia. Those are easy ways to get through. And again, this slide with the 866 Our Vote hotline numbers. If you can promote this information through social media and between now and election, that would be great. And here's some links for more information. We'll be sending you materials via email, but they will also be posted on Common Cause website. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And now it's time for questions. So if you want to ask a question, you can, best way is to unmute yourself. There is a little way of putting your hand up. I'm not sure how to show you how to do it exactly. But you can also do the chat if you want. I'll try to monitor that at the same time. Questions? Who has a question? I can't imagine no one has any questions.
I have a question.
Okay, what's your name?
What? This is Nancy.
Yeah.
Hi.
Nancy.
So you just gave us a lot of information, and I was taking some notes, but I didn't get it all down. Are you going to send us all that information that you just gave us in written form of some kind, or will we have it when we go to volunteer?
Yes, there is both frequently asked questions about the law, And the PowerPoint will also have recording that you can review again. And there is a number of other documents that you'll be getting via email.
Okay. And then when will we get our assignment? Because I'm going to be actually out of the country for the next 2 weeks, and I'm getting back just in time for the election.
So you will get them via email about sometime next week.
Okay.
If you fill out that form, which you filled out to be on the training about where you want to be and if you want to be with anybody in particular, you will be assigned with them.
Okay.
So I see a question about if people are in line and have not voted when the polls close, what happens? That actually should have been in the presentation. I'm not sure where it is. But when the polls close at 8 p.m. at night, but anyone who is in line by 8 p.m. has the right to vote, and they cannot prevent them. So they typically have a poll worker stand outside at the end of the line at 8 o'clock, and then shoo people away who get there after 8. But anybody in front of them gets to vote, even if it takes 2 hours. So this is a good question from Sarah. You see a poll worker giving incorrect information. Do we talk to them or report it to the command center? Report it to the command center. Never, ever, ever correct a poll worker. There are certain circumstances where we'll say we'll talk you through it, where you might want to go to the warden, but you never go directly to somebody and say you're doing that wrong. It's usually not one, they're in the process of interacting with voters, so that interferes with the voters' experience, and 2, it's a confrontational manner, and we want to make sure that everything's handled as professionally as possible and that we have all the information and that nothing is mistaken. So call the command center, we'll talk it through, and we'll go through there. I see a question about assignments. Assignments are for a 3.5-hour shift. You can sign up for more. You can stay later if you want. But everybody is being assigned for 3.5 hours. So here's somebody that says, in 2016, my polling station had very poor disability access. Are we checking for this? Yes, we are. That's part of our polling place assessment that we'll be asking you to fill out and review. Depending on what the issue is, we may not be able to do anything about it immediately, but we should be able to do something about it, depending how bad it is. We can get them to unlock handicap access if there is any, or provide wheelchairs or otherwise get assistance through the election administrators in the town. Other questions? Quiet group.
Well, this is another one about assignments. When I filled out the form, I checked in 2 time blocks, but I only really want to do 1 3.5 hour. I thought it was sort of an either or kind of a thing. So I can't do 7 hours straight. Too old. Well, so do I go back and try to correct that?
I'll try to make sure that we deal with that. I think it should be fine.
Okay.
Sophia usually doesn't assign people for 7 hours.
Okay.
I might have been me, but she's better. So some of you may have done this before. I think that, you know, even if you have a relatively quiet day, most people really enjoy doing it. They end up helping usually at least some voters in the process, and you're collecting information then that we can use to improve our process in the long run. It really is a great way of being of service without being particularly stressful. So let's see, somebody says, I'm the opposite. I was planning to work all day as a way to let people know how long I want to work. I think there's a section for comments. Just write that there. Not here on the comments for the webinar, but on the sign-up sheet, if you can go back. If not, shoot me an email and I will address it that way. So a question about electioneering. Electioneering is really not something that we worry about particularly, as long as the people are not harassing voters or electioneering inside the polling place. But the 150-foot rule is very sporadically enforced, and frankly, I also think many of us think is unconstitutional because it hasn't been challenged in many, many years. The rule for abortion clinics is 30 feet, and that is not even from the door. That's from, can be even closer. So we try not to hassle people too much about, you know, being respectful if they're, you know, Boston is a lot of places where 150 feet would be nowhere close to where the polling place door is. We will be trying to send you some information. There will be, unfortunately, the t-shirts and buttons won't be here until late. And we're not sure you're going to be able to wear them inside the polling place anyway. I do have buttons here at Common Cause from last year. But we may be sending some in the mail. You can certainly get stuff here. We also have lawn signs that you can put on your lawn that will be coming in, but not till very late, which is very silly because, you know, they should be much earlier. We won't be sending those in the mail though. Okay, any other questions? So we're about just a few minutes shy of our 60 minutes. Any other questions? I'm buying the chat at the same time because people seem to like to write their questions. It can be a lot of fun. It can also be very quiet, but that's okay too. We really appreciate your service, and if you have others that can volunteer with you or that you know, just push it out to your contacts and get them signed up so that they can participate too. There are election protection is a 50-state activity, but there aren't field volunteers in every single state. That on what the local organizations want to do and what their capacity is. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to say thank you very much. Have a good night, and stay tuned. You'll be getting some information via email from me. Oh, we got one more new question, I think. Nope. Okay. Everybody, have a good night. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Right. Bye-bye.